this is a really good sugya. I'm very excited about this sugya, so I'm glad that you guys are here. This is the sugya of Talmud Torah versus Tefila, versus like a strange way of saying it. But we're going to be looking at the sugya really of what the Rambam calls mitzvahs Talmud Torah gedolah mitzvahs Tefila. That the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is greater than the mitzvah of Tefila, which sort of already gives away our answer. But that's what we're going to be looking at.
Can one ask the question at the very beginning why the Rambam chooses Tefila as opposed to any other mitzvah?
Yeah, we'll see, because it's going to be based on a specific case that we're going to be looking at. So that's where we're coming from here. So it's not just stam that the Rambam is judging these two things and saying these things, but it comes from a specific place that we're gonna look at. Okay, so let's get started here. Okay, let's look at our first. So the first thing we're going to see is two different Gemaras, which are not by nature they're not like contradictory. No one brings them up, at least that I've seen, one versus the other. But I think that they are somewhat like contradictory, I'd say. Okay, so the Gemara says like this: okay, so the Chassidim Rishonim with daven, they would put an hour preparation for their davening before they davened. Then they would daven for 1 hour, and then they would go back and spend an hour, I guess, like recovering from their tefillah. They would spend another hour recovering from the tefillah. So the Gemara asks a great question. It says, Torah says, how do they do their work? How do they get Torah done, Torah learning done? That's 9 hours out of your day already, right? That you're spending on prepping for tefillah or after tefillah. So how do you go ahead and daven? How do you go ahead and learn? Right, so it says that mitoch chassidim, they were chassidim, not today's chassidim, but they're chassidim like a chassidim of like they're great pious men, and therefore Torah mishtamaris, their Torah was guarded. It was guarded. Okay, great answer. Fine, so you don't have to worry so much. The Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara comes up with a case. It says as follows: Rabbi Elazar Omer safek kara kriya shema, safek lo kara. Right, let's say you're not sure if you said Shema or not. Okay, so Choser Korish Kriya Shema. So it's pretty simple. You go back and you say Shema, no loss, right? But it's also a mitzvah daraisa. So if you're not sure about it, we generally repeat it. Safek hispal, safek lo hispal, ain't a Choser hispal. When it comes to davening, so if you're not sure if you davened or not, so then you should go back and daven. You should not go back and daven. Again, the problem being that tefillah is brachos. And then you're saying brachos for apparently, at a suffix, and we generally say that suffix brachos you shouldn't say. Okay, Rav Yochanan disagrees. Rav Yochanan says, "Halavai she's paladin kol yom kula." Says, what's the big deal? So it's great if a person would daven the entire day, right? So generally we don't have tefillah that you do the entire day. Try not to say brachos unnecessarily, right? So okay, fine. So that's generally what we do. But here in this case, the Shemon Esrei, right? A person can daven all day long. That's a great thing for a person daven all day long. So let him repeat his Shemon Esrei. We'll figure out some way to handle the brachos. Okay. So the basic question here that we see these two Gemaras that seem to be going one against the other is one seems to say you shouldn't spend so much time in davening. Gemara questions if you spend so much time in davening. So that's how could you spend so much time in davening? It takes away from your learning. And this saying of Rabbi Yochanan seems to say that it would be great if a person davened all day long, right? So a basic question really is how would Rabbi Yochanan deal with this Gemara? How would he explain this Gemara? Right? That's our now again the question is like an interesting question. It's not the greatest question. This isn't like how come Tosfos didn't address this question? Right? Tosfos didn't address this question because it's not such a great question. So that's why he didn't come up with it. But it enters us into a great discussion about the two mitzvos, about Talmud Torah and Tefila, as in terms of where should a person be putting their energy. Now, also a great question, more to do with philosophy than to do with we're discussing like where a person's avodas Hashem is best, which is how this question would be phrased. So not so much to do with lumdus, but we're going to see that it really it helps us enter into a great lumdish question. So that's where we're going. I'm using this as what we call heichatimso, like a way of getting into a better question. But keep this question in mind. Okay, so Tosfos here in Brachos says as follows: Hadamar leo avaishis paladam koyam kulo. Okay, so Tosfos has a big problem with this. It says, as Rav Yochanan says, that it'd be great if a person davened all day long, right? So he says, wait, hold on a second. That's not such a like easy thing to say. Hainu dafka suffik hispalo, right? So he says that when Rav Yochanan says that it'd be great if a person davened all day long, he wasn't saying if a person was starting off their day and what should they do all day long, daven, and Yochanan would say that's great. You should a person could daven all day long. Rav Yochanan is saying hainu dafka suffik hispalo. That's only in a case where a person is mesupak, if he's in doubt if he davened or not. Then a person can take advantage of this idea that a person should daven all day long. Meaning, really, it's not the way that Tosfos is understanding of Yochanan is that it's not like a full-fledged license to pray all day long. It's limited specifically to a case where a person is not sure if he davened. Then and only then does the mechanism of you can daven all day long come into play, because what it's really doing is it's saying that this is a principle that can be used in the case of suffik, because normally in the case of suffik brachos you wouldn't go ahead and pray, right? And I would say in the case of suffik brachos you wouldn't say that you should go ahead and say more brachos. How a person should say mizonos all day long? No, we don't say that, right? We say you should limit it. So here Rav Yochanan is saying there's something different about tefillah than a regular bracha, right? Because that's our fear. Our fear is, as you see here, right? Look at Rashi here. We're going to skip down to source number 6. Rashi says, Rav Yochanan Maseches brachos the aim tefillah yisir mishum bracha vatala, right? So normally I'd be worried about bracha vatala. Rav Yochanan's principle also says coming to address our normal fear of bracha vatala. Since he says lavai shis paladam kol yom kulo, as Rashi says, we don't have to worry here about bracha vatala. Why not? Because a bracha vatala means a bracha that you'd say that's not necessary. It's unnecessary. But since I could daven, there's no such thing as when I can't daven. Can't daven. Sorry, can't daven. Yochanan says, no, there's no such thing as a time you can't daven. There is a time I can't say mizonos. When can I not say a mizonos? I can't say a mizonos when I've already eaten a cookie, or right, I'm in the middle of eating my mizonos, or I don't have a cookie. So then it's not how I should make brachos all day long. Then I can't make a bracha. There's a specific time. So I'd say, when's the time for davening? So you'd be like, no. Rabbi Yochanan says there is no time for davening. There's a time you have to daven, but there's no time where you can't daven. Is what he says. Okay, so that's Tosfos. Tosfos says this is only in a case where you're not sure if you davened or not.
So Rabbi, the first way to understand it is you can daven 9 hours a day, so to speak, just repeating Shmona Es, right? And this, you're saying from Tosfos, there's no specific time to daven because you can daven something all day. And then it's just a question of if you should repeat something that you may or may not have said. So they're really two completely different explanations of what Rav Yochanan said.
Rav Yochanan, yeah. And Rav Yochanan, there's two different explanations. But if we go back to the Gemara, there's really three explanations, because keep in mind, right? The first explanation doesn't allow for Rabbi Yochanan. Right. The first explanation, right, says that there's no such thing as a principle that allows you to repeat davening. If you didn't daven, you didn't daven. You're not allowed to go ahead and daven more, right?
But where's Rabbi Yochanan saying you can repeat davening?
He says no. Here he says Rabbi Yochanan says Rabbi Yochanan, right? And it tells us Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says, "Oh, why she's paladam kol yom kulo." That's Rabbi Yochanan disagreed. Right? That's what the Gemara is saying, right? That's Pashut Pshat in the Gemara. Pashut Pshat in the Gemara is Rabbi Yochanan is disagreeing. So you really have here. You have that we've seen so far, right? We've seen this idea that you cannot, if you're not sure if you daven or not, regular bracha vatala rules apply. You can't go ahead and try davening again, right? That you can't do that. You're supuk if you daven or not, you missed out. That's it. Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says no, right? You should daven all in. Then we have two different understandings. One we haven't seen yet, we're going to, right? Which is that this is a rule that applies all the time. Tosfos comes along and says, just be careful. Understand, right? That this is only in a case if you're mesupuk, if you're not sure if you daven or not. Good? Okay. The Rashba comes along, and the Rashba is going to bring up the Raavad, right? And he's going to say the Raavad has a different way of understanding this. He says, "Raavad zal." We're just going to skip down to the Raavad. Perish de'enu chozer mispal enu chayav lachzor mispal kamar being ratza lachzor rashai. It's not what he's saying. He says, "Rabbi Yochanan amar chozer kolomar chayav lachzor." Right? Rabbi Yochanan says, not only are you do you have a reshus to daven. Right? Not only are you allowed to daven, Raavad understands it differently. You have to daven in a case of suffix, right? Saying Rabbi Yochanan's allowance of halvai shis pal kol yom kulo, right? When he says that you wish you could daven all day long, that's actually a mechayev. It obligates you to daven, right? So in any time during the day where I might have to daven, Rabbi Yochanan's idea that I can daven all day long, or I shouldn't say I can. That it would be wonderful if you could daven all day long. That actually acts as a mechayev that obligates you to daven all day long, right? That tells you have to daven now all day long, right? Which is a fascinating opinion here, right?
But still, is the Raavad suggesting that you should daven repetitiously, or just if you're unsure if you daven, you should daven again?
He's definitely not saying you should keep davening repetitiously. That's for sure not. What he is saying is, he's saying that any time that you think you might have to daven, right? Anytime
and you're unsure if you did.
You have to, so for sure you should daven. Any hesitation you have, Rabbi Yochanan will come along and say, why are you hesitating? However, you should be able to daven all day long, right?
Halacha l'maisa, if you're unsure whether you daven, to get out of the problem of a bracha levatala, and to make sure you just add something to the
yeah, that's halacha
l'maisa.
That's halacha l'maisa. It's funny because I just learned this. The halacha my father brings up. I just learned with my son Moshe. We started learning hilchos tefillah together. So he just learned it, and the Rambam. It's going to be shocking. I was going to bring it at the end because I think the Rambam is only addressing like not even a suffix case, but the Rambam says if a person wants to, he can daven all day long. He just throws it away. Maybe he'll bring it in at the end. I'll bring the halacha is like it's like a throwaway line by the Rambam that doesn't really address our sugya. It seems like it could, and I'm sure if somebody was arguing that I got this wrong, they'd bring up this Rambam, but it's pretty easy to show that this Rambam doesn't apply to what we were saying. But yeah, a person could add in a halacha l'maisa. We hold that a person can daven what's called the Tefillas Nedava, which is not every tefillah, but like on a Tuesday morning at like 10 o'clock, a person gets home from Shachris and he's like, that just wasn't enough for me. I want to daven again. So the person could daven what's called a Tefillas Nedava, and then ideally he should add in something new that has to do with every bracha of Shemona Esrei, but he could get away with just one bracha. If he just says something, adds in something new to one bracha, that's okay. You can't do that for Musaf, and you can't do that on Shabbos and Yom Tovim really for Musaf, but you could do it at other times. I've never seen anybody do this. I've never heard of anybody do a Tefillas Nedava. Yeah, it's very strange. But my father's right that if you were Supa, I would definitely suggest somebody came to me and said, I'm not sure if I should daven or not. Because I think I daven mincha, but I don't know if I daven mincha. I can't remember if I daven mincha or not. So I would say that the person should just daven Tefillas Nedava, and before his Tefillas Nedava, he should say, if I'm chayiv in mincha, this is mincha. If I'm not chayiv in mincha, then this is going to be my Tefillas Nedava, and I'm going to add something into one of the brachos of Shemona Esrei in order to make sure that if it's a Tefillas Nedava, I did what I was supposed to. Okay, fine. I hope that was
the actual case. The actual case, if I can just bring it up, is Friday you daven an early mincha. And then you go to shul in the evening, and they're davening mincha, and you just automatically daven mincha again. In the middle of your Shemona Esrei, you realize, wait a second, I already daven mincha, so now my tefillah is going to be a Tefillas Nedava.
Right. It come a lot of cases. You're on an airplane, and you're not sure which tefillah you davened. If you didn't daven, you know what the chassidim were doing in the back. You have no idea, you know? So that's like, right, you think you're davening shachris, they're davening mincha, you don't know, you know? Like, you can come up with great cases. Okay. Okay, so the question is, what's the difference between what's the machlokas here between Tosfos and the Raavad in terms of Tosfos saying this is only a case of suffix, and the Raavad saying that no, you're chayiv. You know, it's not just a case where you might be able to, you might not be able to. The Raavad says you're chayiv. Okay, that's our next question. Okay, then we saw Rashi here that he says it's all about a bracha levatala. Okay. This next Mishnah in Perkei Avos is used to explain the Gemara. This is a little more on the philosophical side, but it's cool stuff. So this Mishnah Perkele says, "Who I omer ein bor yerechek v'lo haaretz chassid." Right. So this one line, lo haaretz chassid. A lot of the Achronim bring up this Mishnah to explain. Right. The Gemara said that these chassidim rishonim would daven. They'd spend 9 hours a day on their davening, 3 hours. Right. So you'd say, okay, what kind of people are these? How do they know anything? Right. So they call them chassidim, and the Mishnah says that an Amaretz can't be a chassid. Right, meaning that an Amaretz is in Mirimus, like one of the lay people, right? So an Amaretz can't be a chassid. So the chassid has to be a tam chacham, right? So and that's why a lot of people say the Gemara says that the Gemara in Bracha says that you have to be, the Torah is mishtameres. It's guarded for him, like it's preserved, right? Not that he automatically gets learning, but that his learning that he already did was preserved. So this refers to a chassid. Okay, we're going to come back to that. That has not just a shkafic connotations. This is something interesting I saw quoted in the Nefesh Chaim. I haven't looked at the Nefesh Chaim in 25 years, so it's exciting to see open up the Nefesh Chaim again. And just parenthetically, because I know some of you care about my life, so I opened up the Nefesh Chaim, and I literally had not opened the book in 25 years. So I opened it up, and out came. I used to learn it b'chavrusa with Rav Sinai, Harini Kaparas Mishkavo, and out came 7 pages of notes that I had taken in my learning with Rav Sinai. So I got to read that. That's a very good thing. So then I figured I should quote the Nefesh Chaim. Okay, so his Nefesh Chaim says, well, he's bothered by what were the chassidim, these chassidim doing in the hour after davening. Okay, the hour before I personally think that the hour before they were saying Pesukei Zimra, right? That's what I think they were doing. I think that's what that the hour before is talking about, that they're saying Pesukei Zimra, and that got them ready for davening. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. That's my feeling. It could be I want to say that because I don't understand what anybody would do for an hour just sitting there, but that's what I think that they're saying Pesukei Zimra. The hour during davening I get, but what were they doing the hour after davening? Right? That's like I understand. What are you like? What you're not preparing because it's afterwards. So what are you doing? So he says like this. He says now this is different lashon than we're used to because this is like Kabbalistic stuff. This guy, he's talking about people that are on a high level, like a very, very high level. He says they're not even in this world. They're people that are like above and above. He says, it's very hard when they're in davening. They're like in a totally different world. They're in like this trance with God, right? That they're there with God and they're in this total trance. And it's very hard for them after being in this trance of them with God, for them to just re-enter the normal physical world that we have. So it's like they went from this highway to down low, and this is what they were talking about. This is what they were doing after Tefila. They were like re-entering the world. Okay, fine, nice. Okay, so the Shita Mekubetzes has a different approach, which I can't understand how it works with the Gemara. Shita Mekubetzes says that when it talks about an hour before, an hour afterwards, and an hour during davening, it's not really talking about a full 60-minute hour. It's talking about like just a period of time. But that's hard to understand because then that makes the Gemara's question of when were they learning like really harsh. Because if you're talking about like it's like 10 minutes, and the Gemara says they spent 10 minutes like before davening, 10 minutes in davening, 10 minutes after davening, what was the learning? So the Gemara is like really stark on Bittul Torah then in that case. Okay. The Yerushalmi has a different language, which is fascinating. The Yerushalmi says, and this is we're going to have to ask, what's the difference when the Yerushalmi says that they would that it wasn't that their tefillah was their learning was mishtameret, that it was preserved, but rather it was says hayu chasidim haisa bracha nisenes b'torasa. A bracha was given to their learning, right? So that's something that's different. That means that the question is, what does that mean? That their they had their learning was blessed. So that's a good question. What does it mean their learning was blessed? Okay, let's go on here to our next source. I'm sorry, I apologize for how small it is here, the source sheet. So the Rambam says as follows. Okay, so we're going to go through a bunch of Rambams. The Rambam, I'm not going to go through these inside because we did it on the introductory Shiur and this, right? So, but the Rambam says like this. He says that a person should split up the learning into 3 parts, right? 3 for Torah Shebechtav, 3 for Torah Shebal Peh, and 3 for like what we would call like learning in depth. Okay, And then the Rambam says a day has 24 hours, and it's enough for a person to sleep for 8 hours. And then the Rambam goes ahead and says that a person should work for 3 hours a day and learn for 9 hours a day. Okay, so if you have all of those, if you add up the day as the Rambam sees it, right? So then you're going to have a 24-hour day. You're sleeping, let's say, 8 hours. The Rambam says it's enough to sleep 8 hours. So let's say you sleep 6 hours according to the Rambam, right? And let's say you go to work for 3 hours, and then you're learning for 9 hours, right? So then out of your day, that adds up to 20 hours already. So you don't have 9 hours for davening, right? So it's clear the Rambam is not factoring this Gemara in that you should be learning for 9 hours a day. Davening for 9 hours a day, because if he felt you should be davening for 9 hours a day, that would find he doesn't even mention Tefila, right? In this daily schedule of his, right? So like in the 4 to 6 hours that you have for leisure time, which includes your eating, which includes your human interaction, your social time, right? So the Rambam, it seems, would love Corona, right? Because it saves so much time. So you have no social interactions, you have all your leisure time, everything the Rambam has would come down. Again, maybe you do your leisure time on Shabbos with the 3 hours that you normally go to work. So now you don't have to go to work. So you have 3 hours to talk to people, catch up on the whole week. But here you have, but you don't have time. You don't have 9 hours for davening. You have 6 hours to do all your socializing, leisure time, and davening. That's at most you have according to the Rambam schedule. Now, it looks like you only have 4 hours for all of that. So that's not 9 hours. Okay. Then the Rambam in the third parak of his Hilchos Talmud Torah, he's very stark on how important the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is. So he says that you don't have any mitzvahs that are as great as Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, we know. He says the reason is Talmud Mevei Lidei Maisa, right? That Talmud brings you to action. So since Talmud brings you to action, it's much greater. Okay. Then the Rambam says that that if a person has a mitzvah of Talmud Torah in front of him and another mitzvah, so if the mitzvah is possible to be done by somebody else, then the other person should do it. If not, then you should do that mitzvah, but come very quickly back to your learning. Okay, and then the Rambam says that tchilos dino shel adam, that a person's judgment is first on Talmud Torah, right? That a person's first judged on Talmud Torah. Okay. So that's it shows that how important the learning is, right, to the Rambam. And the Rambam doesn't seem to be putting too much emphasis on Tefila here at all. Okay, now we get to the case and the important stuff here. Here's the Gemara in Shabbos. Gemara in Shabbos says as follows: Tanya, Chaverim shayu asukim oskim b'Torah. Chaverim were, I know in modern Hebrew, chaver means friend, but chaverim were a group of people. They were scholars, and they were makbid. They were careful to make sure that they didn't become tamei. Okay, that's to become a chaver required a process by which you swore in front of other chaverim, and other chaverim accepted you, and they testified on your behalf that you're careful about this stuff. So chaverim were like a really high level of religious observance. These are people that were very, very very, very careful about Torah mitzvahs. He says, "Chaverim shayu oskim b'Torah." So, in other words, just one more thing. So, like a chaver is somebody that you could like go to their house and be sure that you wouldn't become tamei there, right? So, if like you got an invitation to somebody's house and you were a chaver, you would never accept the invitation. And probably society-wise, you knew not to invite somebody that was a chaver. And if somebody invited you to the house and you said, listen, I'm a chaver, so they'd say, okay, I'm not a chaver, so I understand you can't come to my house because you don't want to become tamei. It was like a different designation. It wasn't like somebody who's makbid on keeping mahadrin, right? That's not what we would say. That's not the idea. Okay, so he says as follows. He says that chaverim shahayu, this is Gemara. Chaverim shayu oskim b'Torah. So these special people that were involved in Torah, so mafsikin the Kriya Shema, ve'im mafsikin the Tefila, they would stop their learning. These people were learning all the time, and they would stop to say Shema every morning and every night, but they wouldn't stop to daven. Now they would say, okay, it's time for Kriya Shema now. So everybody stop what you're doing, and let's take a break and let's say Shema. So they would say Shema, and then they would go back to their learning, but they wouldn't do that for davening. They wouldn't daven. Amar Rav Yochanan, lo shanu elo kigodon Rishim Bayachai v'chaverav. Hold on a second. This isn't even regular chaverim. This is like Rishim Bayachai and his friends. Who were these guys? Shetar son and Munasad. These are people who every single second of their day was spent in learning. Forget about the fact that they didn't go to work, because we know the Gemara in Brachos that talks about Shimei Chai felt that it was usher to work, right? So we're not talking about that it wasn't that they didn't go to work. It was that they weren't involved in anything. There was nothing else that they were involved in. Like, to the point where they saw Tefila as Bittul Torah, right? So they were really just, they ate very little. They didn't do anything else but learn. Aval Kagon Anu, right? So this is Rabbi Yochanan. Now, keep in mind, who was Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan was the one that says, Alvai Shishpal Adam Kol Yom Kulo, right? If you remember that. So he says, Anu Mafsikim L'Kriya Shema Tefila, but we stop for both. We daven like a normal person, right? We daven, okay? So, and then the Rambam paskins, and here's the halacha. Mishai Osik V'Talmud Torah, V'Yizman Tefila. So let's say I'm learning, and it came time for davening, right? By the way, this doesn't apply to most people, right? Most people never have this situation. Most people have a daily schedule, right? So they know when they're going to stop it, and they know when they're going to learn. They don't have situations where they're just learning. But this really does happen to all of us, those of us that stay up all night on Shavuos, right? You say, okay, I'm going to stay up all the way till davening. Right, so when they make a clap on the bima and they say, "Okay, it's time to daven," so then everybody stops their learning to daven, right? That's when this applies to us. So then you'd stop and daven. Right? Let's say you're just. This isn't talking about somebody koel. This is talking about, let's say, somebody who just doesn't do anything else but learn. Ain't no posek. He doesn't stop. So now why? Why doesn't he stop? Right? The Rambam usually doesn't give a reason. Here he gives a reason. Because the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is greater than the mitzvah of Tefillah, right? I mean, he says it straight out. Right? So he says okay, that's something else. Okay, so right.
So Rabbi, in the examples you're giving, not only is it not necessarily applicable to the general population, but what if you're married and you have kids and you see them on occasion? Does that mean that you're not in the category of davening or learning all day? Like if you see your wife for dinner for 15 minutes, you're no longer.
You're done. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the Rav Shimei Chai didn't have dinner with the family. You know, right? And keep in mind with the lifestyle that these people lived. Right, Rav Shimei Chai lived in a cave for 13 years. Right?
Right. So it's not just an exception. It's exception on top of exception on top of exception.
Yeah, this is like a very special class of people. Right. Okay. So, and I would say, I'm going to use this word not in a derogatory way, but I'd say the people that were Torah Emunah Son, that they were only involved in learning, and I don't mean this derogatorily, but because the word irregular isn't strong enough. I would say they are abnormal, right? And as they are outside the norm of even the other Tanoim that lived at that time. Right.
Right. You'd almost need like a heter not to get married. Right. Like,
right. Exactly. There are people like that. Right. This is almost at that level. Okay. So the question that we have to ask is now I'm not asking why, because we're not making this philosophical, but in what way is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah greater than the mitzvah of Tefillah, so as we don't stop our learning for Tefillah? How does that work? When the Rambam says Shemitzvah Talmud Torah gedolah mitzvah Tefillah, right? So when I say that something is greater, what's the metric? What are we measuring here? Right? There's no points in mitzvahs, right? We don't have mitzvah points, right? So if I don't have points for mitzvahs, what's the Rambam talking about that he says that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is greater than the mitzvah of Tefillah? Greater in what way? How is it greater? Right? And if you tell me it's greater because you don't stop for learning, you don't stop for davening when you're learning, so then that's repetitive, right? Then the Rambam's not explaining anything. Then he's just saying we don't stop our learning. Right, we don't stop our learning for davening because mitzvah's Talmud Torah is greater because we don't stop for tefillah. That's not how it isn't saying anything, right? So there has to.
Don't we have mitzvah kala, mitzvah chamura?
Yeah. So the question is, so what is that? So mitzvah kala, mitzvah chamura, right? So okay, so you want to say that, fine, okay, but how do we understand that, right? How does that work? That's our question here. Okay. So
what about Talmud Torah K'neged Kulam?
Talmud Torah K'neged Kulam we saw, right? We saw that halacha. But what is that? So Shlomo says Talmud Torah K'neged Kulam, right? That it's equal to all their mitzvahs. But in what way is it equal to all their mitzvahs? Right? What makes it equal to all their mitzvahs? What is the value? Right? And it's not philosophical. What's the conceptual value? There is philosophical value. Don't get me wrong. There is a way we can address this in a philosophical sense. but what's the value here, right? That's our question here. What's the value that we're measuring? I just don't understand. Okay, so so those are our questions. Now we have a bunch of sources to help us with our answers here. Okay, so the Rambam says as follows. The Rambam says in Hilchos Deos, right? We're familiar with the Rambam's golden mean, that you have a spectrum of personal character traits that a person has, right? And a person can go to either extreme, right? It can be very generous, it can be very stingy. And the Rambam says that a person should always be sort of in the middle, right? A person should always be in the middle ground. So the person that the Rambam says that is in the middle ground of every single midah that a person has, he is, if you look at the last line here, he says, he's nikra chacham. That person's a chacham. The chacham in modern Hebrew, we always associate with somebody who's very wise, he's scholarly, right? That's the chacham. But that's not what the Rambam calls a chacham. A chacham to the Rambam is obviously somebody who's scholarly, but also somebody who's perfected in their character traits. That's the chacham to the Rambam. Okay? Now keep that in mind. In the next halacha, the Rambam says he describes somebody who then is midaktik al atzmo v'yoter, right? He's very careful with his character, right? What is that? How is he careful with his character? So he goes a little more to one extreme than the other, right? But just a little, because too much to the extreme the Rambam holds is not good. But he's just a little more careful on certain things. Okay. Now it's case by case, so he can't give like real examples. Okay. But he says, right, that this person is obviously not the chacham, because he just described the chacham as the person who's straight down in the middle. But this person is called the chassid. That's this chassid. Okay. Now the Rambam is very careful with his language when he uses words. He's using words from the Mishnah and from the Gemara. Right. So when the Gemara says that the chassidim were davening 9 hours every single day, or spending 9 hours on their tefillah every single day, this is the chassid that the Gemara was referring to, according to the Rambam, right? That it's the person that goes, he's a mikdaktik al atzmo biyoter. Okay, he goes a little further than what we're supposed to do, right? And that person is no longer the chacham; he's the chassid. Okay, so here's what I'd like to suggest. I'd like to suggest that our main overall question was Tefila and Talmud Torah, and which is greater and what makes something greater. So I would like to say as follows: that a regular Jew, okay, a quote unquote regular Jew. When I say a regular Jew, I mean a Jew who opens up the Torah and he says, "What should I do?" Right? How should I? So the Rambam says I should work for 3 hours a day, and I should work for 3 hours a day, and I should learn for 9 hours a day, and I should sleep for 6 to 8 hours a day, right? That normal person, right, that says, what should I do? And I'm going to make sure that I'm walking in the golden mean between my character traits are okay. So that normal person, the normal chacham, right? So that person, Torah study takes priority in terms of how much time is spent versus tefillah, right? That's a normal person. Okay, the chassid, who's Torah son, Emunah son, right, and who goes way beyond what's the norm for what a person should do, but he goes to the extreme, right, and checks his character to the extreme, makes sure that he does that he's only learning, right. That's the Torah son, Emunah son, the chassid, the chaver, right. This person that's exceptional, what we call abnormal, what we said, right, not in a derogatory way, but abnormal. That person doesn't even pray, right? He doesn't even pray. So the idea is when you talk about the value of praying versus Torah study, so Torah study is going to take precedence in all people. In all people, Torah study is going to take precedence. When it comes to how much precedence does it take, so for the average person, you daven when you're supposed to daven, and you daven a normal time to daven, and you don't allow your davening to really come at the expense of your Torah study. In other words, at the end of the day, when I look at my day, how did I spend my day? So I spend my day, I got my 9 hours of learning done, right? And I divided up the way I was supposed to. And I davened the normal time I was supposed to daven, but my davening didn't take away from my learning. Right? If a person said I got into the davening today, and I really learned I davened for an hour-long Shemona Esrei, and then I came out at the expense of some of my learning. I came late to my chavrusa, so that would not be okay, right? That we would say that's not the way a person should be, right? A person should always put their Torah study ahead. Okay, so now, right? So right, that's so the idea of halavai, she's pal adam kol yom kula. Rabbi Yochanan's idea that a person should daven all day long. So that makes sense to us on Tosfos, right? We seem to be looking at Tosfos' way of looking at things and saying that makes sense because in a case where you're in doubt if you prayed or not, then that's a halachic allowance, that principle that, it would be great if a person davened all day long, right? So that makes sense. That allows you to daven even in a case where you're not sure if you davened or not and gets you past, like Rashi said, the problem of bracha levatala. But a normal person should not be davening all day long, right? That's not what Rabbi Yochanan is saying at all, right? Rabbi Yochanan is not saying that a person should spend his entire day davening. That would not be Rabbi Yochanan's opinion here, okay? Right? And the debate between the Raavad and Tosfos about when this applies is a question of how does this value, right, of that a person should daven all day long, does it extend to everyday common situations, right? Tosfos maintains it's not a universal value. It can't be extended. It's not something the principle is not elastic. It applies in only very concrete, specific situations. The Raavad is much more liberal in how he applies this topic and says that it can be applied to be mechayev you to daven, right? Then you're going to have to daven because a person should daven long. Okay. According to we looked at the machokas between, it's not machokas, but the different texts in the Bavli and Yerushalmi, right? In terms of the Bavli says that your Torah will be preserved if you daven for this long, and the Yerushalmi is saying that your learning will be blessed, right? So according to the Bavli, the providence, like the divine providence promised to the chassid, so is that his learning won't be forgotten, right? Because, right, look at these next halachos here. Torah. So Rambam says, when are you chayiv to learn? Until when are you chayiv to learn Torah? Until the day you die. But he says, anytime that you're not involved in learning, you begin to forget your learning, right? And he also says, right? He says, Amru Chachamim, bris krusa. There's a covenant sealed with the Jewish people. Whoever like really works hard on his Torah learning in the Beis Medrash, he won't quickly forget his learning, right? So there's a special divine providence promised to the person who consistently learns Torah. That person who consistently learns Torah, right? That person is promised that he won't forget his learning, right? So that question is, how far does that extend to a person who davens so many hours, right? The chassid now has to worry. Hold on a second, I'm going to be davening 9 hours a day. So what's going to be with my learning? This bris is only if to somebody who's always involved in learning. Then you're promised that I'm not going to forget. So then the Gemara comes along, right? The Bavli says, no, don't worry. The divine providence will still surround you as the chassid to preserve your learning. The Yerushalmi says, no, we're going to go a step further. Not only will it be blessed that you won't forget, but you're going to also you're going to be blessed that you'll grow in your learning. It'll be blessed to the fact that you grow in your learning. Okay. Okay, so now our question comes down to, hold on a second, what makes Talmud Torah greater than Tefila? And again, not talking philosophically, okay? So the amazing Gemara here. This is just an absolute amazing Gemara. The Gemara says, Rav Chazil Rav Hamuna the Kamarach Mitzalusa. Right? So Rav was praying to Rav, and Rav Hamuna saw him. And he saw he was davening for so long. Right? This is okay. So Amar Manichin Chayisha. So how could you do this? You're giving a Manichin Chayolom. You're giving up the eternal life. And you're just being involved in like Chayisha, and like temporary things, right? Right? And what does that mean? So Chay Olam, Rashi says, Torah, right? The Chay Olam is Torah. You're giving up Torah, which is Chay Olam, which is eternal life. Tefila tzar Chay Shahi, but Tefila is just something that you're doing just for now. The refuah, the shalom, the zonos, right? What's it for? It's to heal. It's for peace. It's for my parnasa, right? It's just for now. No one davens for olam haba. It's not in Shmon Esrei. In Shmon Esrei, we never ask, can you please send me to olam haba? It doesn't work that way, right? Talmud Torah earns me a spot in olam haba, right? So he said, right? So he says, who suffers man tefillah chud? Zman Torah Chud. No, so he says, no, there's a time for davening and there's time for learning. And now's my time for davening. Don't yell at me because I'm not learning now. This is my time for davening. He says, right now, he says, he quotes the pasuk. Masir Azno Mashma Torah Gam Tefila Toevas. He says, if you forget your Torah learning, you put your Torah learning aside, even your Tefila becomes an abomination, right? So the chassid that comes along, and this is what we're trying to apply this pasuk to, the chassid that comes along and says, no, I'm going to be learning now, right? I'm going to be davening now, I'm not going to be learning, right? So he says, no, even your davening is not worth anything. It's an abomination, right? You know, no one wants your right? So how do you understand this pasuk? So Rav Yochanan says as follows, source number 27 here. Rav Yochanan says, Al tishal al tachnusav shehem derech dava shinim nenanim. Af gam tfilaso shehi achova in a miskabel. So even though you're chayiv to daven at this point, right? Excuse me, you have a chayiv to daven, so that's not going to be accepted. This is it's obvious. Any like intelligent person will come to this conclusion. Right? The servant who's not listening to his master and then goes ahead and asks his master for stuff, right? The image that we have is the guy, Kadosh Baruch Hu tells us go learn, and you go ahead and say, no, I'm going to daven, right? So Kadosh Baruch Hu says, now you're going to come ask me for stuff? You're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be in the base medrash, right? So how could you ask? That's the image, right? And the Tosefta says, right, not only is it the learning that makes you tefillah toeva, but not only is it Talmud Torah that pushes up tefillah, and Talmud Torah is so important, but even kosvei sfarim, tefillah and mezuzos, when seeking the kriya shema be'ei masik tefillah, even they, now we don't pass in this way at all, but even they would push off tefillah, meaning that tefillah would not be that important. So what are we saying to sum up here, right? We're saying, in essence, this one line here at the top, mitzvahs Talmud Torah, mitzvahs tefillah, right? That Talmud Torah is greater than tefillah. What makes it greater? What makes Talmud Torah greater than tefillah is this idea that it's chai olam, right? According to the Gemara, it seems to be it's chai olam, that this is something that has eternal value, and tefillah is something that is just for this moment, is just for now. According to the Rambam, I don't know if you would go with this. I think what the Rambam would say, now you go look at it inside, the Rambam would say, I think it's just a lot easier, according to the Rambam would say that it's that when the Rambam discusses precedent and mitzvos, he says, second he says here, he says, this is source number 14. Talmud Torah is like is equal to all mitzvos, right? Why? Because Talmud brings you to action, and therefore Talmud called them a ma'isa b'chol makom, and therefore learning always comes first because it brings you to action, which is always a funny catch-22. Discuss now that Talmud Torah brings you to action, but then when it comes to action, you don't do action, you actually do Talmud Torah because it can bring you to more action. But setting that aside, right? I think that if you ask the Rambam, why is Talmud Torah greater? What makes Talmud Torah greater than Mitzvah Tefillah? He's going to say that it brings you to Lamaisa. That's the idea. So I think the better the easier answer to understand that doesn't require so much work is that Gemara in Shabbos that says that Talmud Torah is Chai Olam, it's eternal life. Right? We always put more value on eternal life. Tefillah is chayisha. It's something that we do for the moment.
Can you explain a little bit this Rambam that you just quoted that talks about tefillah, that Talmud Torah may be l'day ma'isa. It brings you to action.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds like the Limud Torah. It's a very practical kind of a thing, as opposed to an intellectual endeavor. Why should you learn Ben Sora or Mora? It's never going to happen. It's never going to be brought to Maisa.
It's a good question. I tell you, I would have loved if you had asked me the question an hour ago before my whole world was like shaken by an article Rav Schechter just put out. And I would love to have like a discussion. It's very funny because there's this new app called Clubhouse. So I decided to put this Shiur on Clubhouse, and Rav Schechter's son was listening for most of this year. So yummy, Johnny. So that's so I would have loved to to say oh, get your father into Clubhouse, get him to download the app and get on here. It'd be easier to give him the Zoom. He knows how to use Zoom. So Schechter, it was very harsh on people like me who learn Lumdus and don't learn Halacha Maisis. This is the whole reason why COVID is spreading. It's an amazing article. I put it on my Facebook for anyone who wants to see. It's like it'll rock your world. This thing. It totally shook my world. It explains a lot of Rav Schechter and how he understood the Rav and how come he understood the Rav differently than everybody else. But it's really fascinating stuff. So I don't really have an answer.
when the Rambam talks about bris cruza to people that are involved in learning Torah, what does that mean? Anybody who's involved in
I don't hear him either, Rabbi.
Oh, okay. So Avi, you got cut off a little.
anybody that learns Torah on a regular basis, anybody that's involved in any subject matter on a regular basis, they're not going to forget what they're doing. There's no special supernatural
I don't know.
power.
So I think I don't know if that again. I don't know if that I don't want to argue. I just don't know if that's true so much. Like if you learn. If I learn the exact same thing over and over, chance I'm not going to forget it. But if if I finish Seder Taras and I start Seder Kachim, so in about a month I'm going to start forgetting everything in Seder Taras if I'm not constantly reviewing it. So,
No, but everything it touches on one to another. If you live in Israel, you're going to forget parts of American culture.
right. So I'm saying so there's a bris cruza that as long as you're constantly learning, Kosh Baruch Hu is going to help you.
Yeah, I can tell, Mr. Pilichowski, I can tell you I forget all my Torah, so I'm a good proof of that argument. Rabbi, in terms of Rambam's schedule, my understanding of, and I know that I assume the share's over, so I can ask a kind of side question.
Okay.
My understanding of his, from his biography, he worked very hard in Egypt, certainly, as a doctor.
Yeah.
So was he describing the ideal situation, not reality?
There's a letter that he wrote. There's a letter. It's like a verified letter that he wrote that his Talmud asked him a question, and he says I'm not the guy to ask something like that. He says, I only learn on Shabbos now. I'm so busy with the Sultan's medicine.
Right.
The Sultan would have him seeing everybody that the Sultan liked. He would, the Rambam, he said, I only get to learn on Shabbos. So between traveling back and forth to the Sultan, I only get to learn on Shabbos. I don't know.
And then I think in that same letter, he talks about answering all the questions from the community and all of that. And so, yeah, he doesn't seem to hold by his own.
Rabbi Barrel Wine had a great line. He said, you don't judge Torah, you don't judge Judaism by the Jews, and you don't judge Torah by the rabbis. That's on the other hand, the Gemara always says, look at my Sarav, go out and you can learn from the actions of Rav. I don't know enough to know the answer to that. Yeah, I'm definitely not sitting here judging the Rambam. That's for sure.
No, but I'm saying but practically he didn't.
Right.
At the various points of his life, he didn't do that out of necessity.
I assume there was something they felt was pikuach nefesh, or I don't think you could tell the Sultan, sorry, I gotta go learn Torah. Yeah, I don't think that was I assume that's not a viable option. Right.
Sure.
Okay, that was great. Okay, next here, and I start preparing stuff for 2 weeks from now on Purim. The Purim share is going to be amazing. Absolutely. Next week's share is also good. It's gonna be on Pito Maktoris, which you might know better as Inka Alkenu, but which is an interesting share. But in two weeks, the Purim stuff is gonna be absolutely. I've been in a good mood the whole day just from the learning that I did at 5 a.m. from it. It was great. Okay, have a good day, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah.